Hi, everyone. So I'm Emmy Brunner, and I am a psychotherapist. I am a coach. I'm a hypnotherapist. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm a writer. And I have spent the last 20 years working in clinical practice and trying to figure out how to kind of support people, often in crisis, with their mental well-being and how to help people move forward in their lives. And I think it's useful to know a little bit about me and my thinking as a clinician, because a lot of the ways that I've ended up working have been quite unusual or different to some of my peers. Um, and I think a lot of that was rooted in me sort of through my work, uncovering more and more about myself, more and more about my own journey through helping other people, and really learning about how best to support other people through seeing what worked and what didn't work. Um, and I think a lot of what I found challenging as a clinician was working in a therapeutic way with people in a very opaque way, where I would be silent as a clinician and hear somebody else talk about their problems. I often felt that the most worth I could be to people was to help them to identify the obstacles that were in their own way so that they were able to create shifts and change the things that they were unhappy about in their own lives. So, just sharing a little bit about myself, I was raised in an environment where I'd been taught to prioritize everybody else's needs above my own. So I was a real classic caretaker. So being a therapist was like a dream scenario for me because it meant I could be there for everybody else, listen to everybody else's problems. And I was really, really good at being there for people when they're in need. I was extremely intuitive, picking up on moments where I felt people were alone or scared. And I was always willing to go above and beyond to help anybody who needed me. And so initially, I kind of presented as the best therapist because I was always there for my clients. And I was intuitive and I was sensitive. And I didn't recognize early doors kind of the problems that would come with that way of being. It was something that I came to learn. Um, and I was raised in a way that you worked really, really hard in order to be successful, in order to kind of get anywhere, that you really had to graft and get your head down, and that ultimately you'd be lucky if you really made it. So I worked very, very hard to be successful. And in many ways, I really saw myself progressing. My clinical practice was growing. It started off with just me seeing clients one on one, and then that gradually expanded. And soon I started recruiting other therapists, and it eventually became the Recover Clinic, which is the biggest outpatient clinic in Europe today, which has been an amazing journey. But it's also been really exposing for me personally, because particularly in the early days, I worked so hard that I didn't kind of get to a point where I recognized that I was really burnt out and really, really exhausted, and stuck in really damaging relationships in my personal life. I didn't stop to consider what being successful really, really meant for me, or how some of the core beliefs that I had about myself were really holding me back. And so for me, I was so fixed professionally on being successful and creating a security for myself professionally, that I didn't pay as much attention to my emotional and mental well-being, and certainly not my relationships. My relationships were kind of the last piece of the puzzle for me to solve and for me to work on. I've got some little notes here that I'm going to keep referring to because I am a talker, which, if any of you guys have had therapy, you'll know is not always the case. Therapists can be pretty quiet and let you do all the talking, but not me. I'm a chatter. So I'll have to keep referring back to my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything out for you guys. So I think my relationship with self care today is so worlds apart from what it was then. And it really frames now my entire life, my working life, and the relationships I have with others. But what I became to understand is that I was working from a blueprint that I didn't even know existed. I was working within a very blinkered view of myself, of what I thought I was capable of. And I think that's true for all of us. And that's what I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit more about, and why our beliefs about ourselves and our past experiences really do hold us back and limit our potential and our potential growth, personally, professionally, in relationships, in all sorts of ways. So, just like I wasn't, so many people are not living their lives to their full potential, because of the relationship that they have with themselves. They weren't aware necessarily that their limiting beliefs that they had about themselves were dictating everything, all of their choices, all of their behaviors, all of their reactions to those things, to things. And basically, each of us have our own stories and our own experiences, and we've internally stored the memory of those and the impact that they have had on us. And some of those we're really consciously aware of. We're consciously aware when things have happened and the impact they might have had. And sometimes we're not aware, and sometimes we're not conscious of it and how those things may be dictating our choices today. So, part of doing this work is sort of illuminating us to these truths so that we can become really conscious of what's motivating our choices. And during our childhoods, no matter who we are, no matter what kind of childhood we've had, we form a script, the basis of which informs all of our decisions and choices. And so a life script is really a subconscious life plan that we've created in childhood through the interactions between us as children and all of our primary caregivers. We're just not aware that we have it necessarily. So for me, I had a script that totally unknowingly to me was dictating all of my professional choices. It was why I was a therapist, because I'd got this idea of myself as a rescuer, as somebody who was going to be there for other people, who's somebody who was going to solve other people's needs. And it was dictating all of my different choices. In relationships, I struggled to put myself first, personally as well as professionally. And it wasn't until I became really aware of that I was in a position to do anything about it. So, unknowingly, everything that we believe that we're capable of is being put through this filter of our core beliefs about ourselves. And I just want to jump in here now and say, if any of you have got questions about this, or any of this is triggering for you, or anything you want to ask, just jump in the chat and ask me, because I appreciate some of these kind of ideas can seem quite unusual or challenging at first. So these beliefs that we have about ourselves that come from this script that's been formed in childhood, they dictate everything from the relationships that we pursue, to the jobs that we apply for, to what we eat, to how we dress, to how we present ourselves socially, in every single way that we're showing up in our lives. And for so many of us, we are in a process of just reacting to life. We're reacting to the situations that we're in. We're not necessarily conscious that we are playing a role, that we are facilitating some of those situations, that they are facilitated because of this script that we have. So these core beliefs frame everything that we're doing in our lives, and they did in my life. And more than that, because of this script, we will unconsciously seek out people and experiences to reinforce this life script, this core beliefs that we have about ourselves. And in my case, certainly I did some healing when I trained to be a clinician. But prior to that, I was living with a persistently really critical narrative in my head that was almost talking me through every social interaction, every challenging decision that I had to make. And it was undermining me at every step of the way. It was putting me down. And it was like living with almost like the worst kind of bully in your head that you're constantly interacting with. And this critical voice that was in my head was reminiscent of things I'd been told as a child, advice that had been imparted, things that I'd absorbed from witnessing the dynamics around me. And what I came to realize when I started to kind of illuminate myself to this, to really become conscious about what is this voice telling me, it was really based on fear. And it wasn't even stuff that I necessarily believed in. There were rules that I would apply to myself that I would never have applied to anybody else that I knew. There was kind of a set of almost like advice I was giving myself that was limiting my experiences and limiting the opportunities available to me. But it's certainly not advice I would have given to a close friend. It was reserved specifically for me. And I started to question that if I had an entirely different set of rules for me than I did for anybody else in my life, why was I so comfortable with that? Why was I not questioning that? Why was I not getting curious about the origins of some of these beliefs that I had, especially if I didn't even believe in them? And someone's just said in the chat that this really resonates. I think it resonates with so many of us because I think so many of us are caught in this trap of just reacting and not necessarily considering what's prompting our responses to things or what's behind our responses to things. And for me, it all comes back to this script, this set of core beliefs that we have about ourselves and the origins of those. So, as I said, for me, so many of those core beliefs that I had were based on my experiences as a young person and the things that I was told by the people that raised me about who I was. So, this idea of myself as a caregiver, this idea that I needed to minimize my own needs, that it was important for me to put everybody else first, this became kind of immersed into my core of who I was, and then dictated all the relationships that I had around me. So, just for a moment, just sit, and if you're not already, give yourself permission to just think what your story might be. What are the core beliefs that you have about yourself that are framing your choices, your interactions, the opportunities and experiences that you have? Because, particularly in my coaching practice, when I'm talking to people about their potential and what the opportunities might be for them, it is so filtered by what they think is possible within the realms of how they see themselves. So their entire life experience is broken down into what am I capable of based on my beliefs about myself. So thank you for somebody just sharing. Fears around I'm not good enough have been huge for me. And I think that's absolutely massive. This narrative that I'm not good enough is so pervasive and it's so all encompassing that it dictates everything that it is that we're trying to do in our lives. So I'll give you an example of this that I have seen even in my kind of professional life that I've shared, and that is when I'm trying to recruit for new people for one of my businesses. Um, if I know that I want a woman, for example, we employ female clinicians in my clinic, I will minimise the type of qualifications and things that I'm looking for. And I do this because I read years ago when I was struggling to find people to apply for a job. I read that women will only apply for jobs if they meet 90% of the criteria. So they won't kind of wing it or think, I'll have a go, or I think I can do this. And actually, I just need to get in front of somebody. They just don't apply because they don't believe they can. And so part of my kind of strategy to minimize some of the qualifications I'm looking for is I'm trying to encourage people to take a risk, to be brave, to put themselves in front of somebody that they can then connect with, because that's really what we're looking for as employers as well. We're looking for connection with people who we feel that we can kind of share the experience with. And those kind of things are just such great examples of how we minimize ourselves because we don't feel good enough. And that fear is keeping us trapped. So, somebody has just asked another question I'm just going to respond to. If you have a strong reaction to a circumstance, for example, me getting skin problems and scarring as a teenager, is that still linked to childhood? Years later, it still has a big impact. Yes, and that's massively traumatic because if you think during those formative years, when you're so vulnerable and you're also acutely aware of your physical self and you're in that physical transition as well, those wounds don't just disappear through the years as things physically change. Quite often, if we haven't had the nurture and the support to be able to process some of those traumatic experiences, then we remain stuck. And so, although the physical wounds may heal over time, the emotional wounds stay with us. And I think it's an important point to kind of refer you to this idea of what trauma really is, because I think for so many of us, and myself included, I didn't really know what trauma meant. In even all my years of clinical training, and I did train for 7 years, no one talked about trauma in all my professors. And trauma, really, people talk about PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. We can understand that. We can understand when people go through catastrophic events, wars, earthquakes, massive things. We can recognize that they are traumatized as a result. But what we find it harder to connect with and identify ourselves is some of those traumas that are slightly more covert. And I think what you've shared, Sarah, about the experiences you had with your skin problems is an example of that. That how people may have reacted to you, or some of the messages that you've taken about yourself, have still got a massive impact on you, even though it's years later. And I'll put money on the fact that you have a critical voice as well in your head that's telling you that you shouldn't feel like that because it's years later. And that's how the critical voice works. That unkind, unwell voice minimizes our experiences, and it keeps us hidden and it keeps us silenced because we become ashamed and unwilling to share. Somebody else has just asked a question as well. I've also struggled deeply with thoughts of feeling unworthy or fears of being abandoned due to childhood events. I've become enlightened recently about how this has been affecting all areas of my life. Absolutely. These experiences that we go through as children, we don't have the kind of emotional maturity to be able to process those things necessarily at the time. And unless we are around adults who have got the emotional resources to help walk us through those processes, which, my God, aren't we fortunate if we do, then we're left making that experience about us, because children's worlds are actually really quite small. And so when things go wrong in life, it becomes about them. And when nobody contradicts that, or when the adults around us aren't validating our experience or reflecting back to us that actually there is a reason we feel sad, angry, distressed because of the environment we're in. If our experiences are minimized or worse, ignored, then we internalize those things and we become the problem. Yeah. And that really fuels this sense of feeling unworthy and ashamed of who we are. So the next question I've got, or point, is yes, my inner critic has bullied me for years for not feeling good enough. So it's a cycle now I recognize. I've also found some people deeply triggering and being traumatized by those difficult relationships to the point of panic attacks. Partly, the more you get to know yourself and the more you can kind of uncover your core beliefs and your script, then the more able you are to make different decisions about how your life is going. So for me, almost with relationships, it was a question of waking up, almost coming to as if I'd been in some sort of blackout and looking around me and thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? Realizing the gravity of the impact my early choices had made, and coming to with almost like a chink of light and realizing that I had an opportunity to do something about it. And I think what I'm going to go back to my notes now, folks, because as you can see, I'm just, like I said, I'll just chat, chat, chat. So without even realizing or challenging these things, so many of us are living with the limiting binds of these internal critical narratives. And we're not questioning it. We're not curious about them. We're just reacting to them as if they are truth. So that unwell voice, that critical voice, is feeding us a narrative and we are responding to it as if it is truth, rather than having its origins in something that came many, many years before, that maybe even had nothing to do with us. So, as well as providing a consistent stream of self critical thoughts, this voice can also lead us to behave in ways that amplifies our sense of shame. that makes us feel even more unworthy, even more less than. It makes us compare ourselves with other people. It makes us dislike seeing other people succeed, because when that happens, it allows the unwell voice fodder and ammunition to make us feel bad about ourselves, to make us feel less than. It encourages us to see ourselves as better or cleverer or nicer or better looking than other people. We seek out that comparison because we're trying desperately to feel better about ourselves. And that's why we're critical about other people, and why culturally we've got a whole culture being critical of how other people look and feeling superior or better to others. And actually, none of it works. It just makes us feel bad about ourselves. So although there might become some temporary satisfaction in seeing somebody else fail or somebody else not succeed, actually it's almost just comfort for why we're not doing so well, why we're not meeting our potential. And ultimately, it's a hollow victory. It doesn't make us feel good. And that too, that critical side of ourselves becomes even more ammunition for the unwell voice to be unkind to us. So, how do we shift it? How do we shift the story? How do we manage challenging situations? As you shared, Tanya, thinking about people being triggering and finding it traumatizing being in difficult relationships. I think part of becoming conscious, part of becoming awakened, part of recognizing that actually, in all of these different scenarios that we're in, we are the common denominator. It is our choices, often, not always, that have led us into certain situations and certain relationships with people. And it's the negative narrative that we have in our heads that is pushing us into those situations. And so, in order to change them, we need to become really mindful of how we're talking to ourselves, how we're speaking to ourselves, how we are forming decisions, and how we're reacting to things. And we do that by accelerating and escalating our self care behaviors. So many of us, when we're stuck in a negative cycle or we don't like something we're doing, we focus all of our attention on trying not to do that. So all of our attention goes onto what we don't want and what we are trying to stop doing, what we're trying to avoid, rather than focusing all of our attention on what we want to expand. Because whatever we focus on is what we're focusing on. Whatever it is we're putting all of our energy toward is what's going to expand. That's why it's so difficult for people to feel better when all they're doing is thinking about how unhappy they are and what they don't like. And it's why so many people like me try and encourage people to focus on having a sense of gratitude for what you already have, even when you're in a dark place. Because soon as you shift your focus onto something more positive, that's what begins to expand. And if you are in a difficult place in life at the moment, I know how triggering that even can be to hear, and how listening to somebody like me talk about this stuff can be. But I promise you, I know what it is to live in a really dark place. And I know what it is to feel self loathing and, as such, an all encompassing sense of shame. I really do. And it is just making these small changes that begin to stack up, that facilitate a much bigger shift. But it isn't something that we can just click our fingers and it's going to change overnight. It's something that we need to make a commitment to change the way that we view ourselves permanently. Not just kind of, I'm going to be really nice to myself this week, or I'm going to really up my self care and see if I feel any better, but recognizing that actually this relationship that we have with ourselves is a result of core wounds that we have within us. And for those core wounds to heal, for us to begin to feel safe enough to start taking risks, we need to nurture ourselves. And we do that by cultivating a kind of counter response to this critical narrative. So rather than arguing or trying to placate that unwell or unkind voice that you have in your heads, you focus all of your attention on nurturing a voice of compassion and kindness towards yourself. So remember what I said, the energy is going to go to whatever it is you're focusing on. And so often, particularly if you're someone that suffers with anxiety, you'll know exactly what this is like. That unwell, anxious voice starts, and you start negotiating and placating because you just want a bit of relief from it. And every time we're doing that, we're feeding it, we're just giving it more power, more energy, because it's got us engaged in some sort of dialogue with it. As soon as we can step back and observe that unwell voice and recognizing that however it's manifesting, whether it's in anxious thoughts, social anxiety, worrying about what people might be thinking about us, being unkind to us about the way that we look, that it's all origins of the unwell voice. That's the core of the problem. And that our response to that problem is to nurture a kind and compassionate, nurturing voice within ourselves. And it might feel so weird to do this, guys, because if that's all you do, if you are just unkind to yourselves so often, then starting to talk to yourself in a nice way can feel really weird. It felt really weird to me. And I did it because I felt like I hadn't got any other choice, that I had to have a go at doing something different because I knew what being unkind to myself felt like. And I knew where it had taken me, and I knew it wasn't working for me. So, my first question always to people when they want to change things and they feel invested in listening to the unwell voice and reluctant to nurture a compassionate and nurturing voice is, how well is that working for you? If it's not working well for you, then you've got nothing to lose by trying to be kinder to yourself. You've had this for a lifetime. And so you now have an opportunity to do something different, even if it feels uncomfortable. Because what's familiar to us will always feel uncomfortable. No, sorry, will always feel comfortable, even when it's not very good for us. We're drawn to what we know, even when what we know isn't very good. If any of you've been on dates with the same kind of person and you've had the same kind of outcomes, you'll know it's a bit of a moth to a flame situation. We're so drawn to what's familiar to us, even when we know it's not good for us. I'm just going to respond to another question here. How do you deal with being in the moment and being frozen in anxiety and your inner critic kicks in? That's been a big struggle. So typically, our trauma responses are fight, flight, and freeze. So many of us, and I think a little bit is what I was describing to you earlier about waking up. I think I'd been in freeze for a really long time. And I would drift from being in freeze to being in fight. So I was very good at getting myself out of situations if I needed to be, because my fight impulses were really, really strong. So many of us are in fight, flight, or freeze. But what either one of those things really relies on is a level of disconnection. So many of us disconnect from our emotional experiences because they're painful and challenging to remain connected to. We find it difficult. And so, one of the strategies that we have unconsciously developed to try and manage these emotions is by disconnection, by being in fight, flight, or freeze. And so, this scenario that you're describing, Tanya, is being in freeze, it's being in a disconnected state. And then that internal unwell voice having an opportunity to kick in. And I think partly what works is when we start doing this work, what we're really aiming for is a higher level of conscious connection. So we're wanting to wake up, to become conscious and mindful throughout the day. So some of the little things, and they may seem small, just checking in with yourself throughout the day to see how you're physically feeling. Like physically, how am I sitting? Am I comfortable? Am I tense? Am I stressed? Am I holding my shoulders back? One of the things I used to realize that I was doing when I started doing this is just sitting like this with my shoulders all the way up here. And honestly, until I became conscious of it, I would put them down. But this was me. And I didn't even know I was doing that. So partly it was becoming conscious and aware and taking the habit of checking in with yourself in order to make these changes. For me as well, my anxiety was so overwhelming that I felt like I needed to make a consistent commitment to something for that to change. And for me, that was meditation. And if you've tried it and struggled, I totally hear you. I found it really, really hard to meditate. And I really had to shop around to find meditations that worked for me. And anything initially that had me focusing too much on my breath, which by the way now is so peaceful and calming for me, initially was triggering. So don't get too caught up in worrying about what works for other people. Shop around a bit and see what works for you. Because for me, making meditation practice and a short practice every morning, it literally got my anxiety from like 90% down to 20% within a matter of like a month. It was quite incredible. It was so incredible for me that I built it into the clinical practice in my outpatient program. So every single day now we have a taught meditation as part of the healing program, because it is the most successful thing you can do to minimize anxiety. The other thing that I would suggest trying out is doing some breath work. So many of us are holding our breaths. And so often, if we're in that fight, flight, or freeze trauma response, which we often don't even realize we are, particularly if we're really, really stressed, we're so often holding on physically, we're holding our breaths, holding our bodies. And doing some breath work, even when you're going about your regular day, can be really, really healing and really, really soothing and take you back in connection with your physical self. Because this idea that our mind, body, soul is all these kind of separate entities is kind of bizarre to me now. I recognize that thinking and responding to myself in a much more holistic way is what's been really helpful to me. If you have got trauma and you already know you've got trauma and you're struggling to cope, then the answer here is to not start to unpacking it all. It's to take your time and nurture new responses to help you cope and process it before you start unpacking painful material you already know you're struggling to manage. Okay. I'm just going to respond to another question and we'll keep on going into this. Um, Thanks for responding to my comment and sharing so honestly. No problem. I've been doing mindfulness courses and I'm more aware of my inner critic, but I do feel attached to the critical thoughts about my skin, but agree another approach is probably more useful. I think be curious about that, because from working with people with body dysmorphic disorder and eating disorders for a huge part of my early career, what I realized often is that what was manifesting in kind of physical dissatisfaction was really an avoidance of intimacy. Because as long as we thought there was something physically wrong with us, it was almost like a legitimate barrier to being intimate with another person. And I don't even always mean physically intimate, I mean emotionally intimate. It was kind of like the perfect excuse. And so often when we unpacked people's life scripts and what was going on for them and the kind of underneath the surface of these manifestations around body dissatisfaction, were real struggles to be vulnerable, real struggles to be intimate with other people. And no matter who came through the clinic, and still this is true today, the common theme is a difficulty in being intimate in relationships. I think it's difficult for all of us, but I think it's particularly difficult if you've got unprocessed trauma. My response is freeze, and I hate it. It hinders me a lot because it causes me not to process my thoughts. I didn't know that was a part of trauma. Yes, and your response is to be, I imagine, Stella, really unkind to yourself about that, isn't it? Even that, my response is freeze, and I hate it. It feels so angry and cross, doesn't it? What do we need when we're frightened? Because that's what happens when we freeze. We're scared. Think about a small child that you know. What do we do when they're scared? We go and give them a hug, don't we? We reassure them. We're loving to them. We're not unkind to them. We're not intolerant. We're warm and compassionate. And when you're in freeze, that is exactly the response that you need as well. It just might not be your immediate kind of go to because it isn't something that you've learned to do or a learned way of being toward yourself. Partly what coaxes that kind of vulnerable child part of us, if any of you have heard of inner child work, this is precisely what we're talking about. This internal part of us that feels frightened to emerge. What encourages that child part of us to show up is encouragement and love and kindness. Because don't forget, that child part of us isn't just housing these core beliefs, these traumas, it's housing our creativity, our bravery, our willingness to dance and not care what people think, to swing from a tree. These are the things that we do when we're kids because we don't care about that stuff. Something changes at some point and we start to care and we become inhibited, and it holds us back and it limits our experiences as human beings. I appreciate what you said about taking your time to unpack things. I've recently been acknowledging my trauma, and it can feel overwhelming when presented with everything all at once. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a real misconception, actually, that with trauma, we always need to unpack everything. And again, encouraging you to think, if there's any parents out there, encouraging you to think about small children when they go through something difficult or painful. You don't ask them to relive the entire event in minute detail. You want an overview of what's happened, and then you pile on the love and the compassion and the comfort, don't you? And that's, we're not that different as adults. We don't suddenly change as we get older. So often what we really need when we're talking about trauma is we need to be validated by somebody. And that's why it's helpful to share. That's why it's helpful to be brave in a group like this and to take risks and to ask questions, because we're being validated. And that's one of the useful things that therapists can do, is to validate your experience. Because so often when we're growing up, and this was certainly my experience, when painful or challenging or difficult things were happening, they weren't being validated by the people that raised me. They were being dismissed or minimized. And so the message I took was that I was the problem and that I needed to internalize my experiences and not share them because they weren't going to be heard. Sorry, another question. Emmy, why does the mind replay the traumatic events again and again? Is it protecting you in the same way? Any tips on this? Or is it shame? Sometimes a traumatic event can happen because the brain is struggling to process it. And that's when you get a kind of flashback experience. Sometimes the mind avoids replaying traumatic events, yes, because it's struggling to process and it's trying to protect you. And sometimes we simply can't form memories because if something really traumatic has happened to us, we have a disconnect and we're never going to be able to recall the details of those things. So for me, my experience of childhood is extremely patchy. I don't think there's any recall to be done. I simply just don't remember things. I think partly what it is, it's about validating your own experience. So initially we were so reliant on other people to do that for us, but really what that child part of us within us needs is for us, the adult part of us, to step up and to show up for us and to validate our experiences. Because shame, as you say, really does keep us trapped. And it is one of the most annoying things we can experience because it's totally unproductive. Totally unproductive. Very different from guilt, for example. When we feel guilty, sometimes it gives us the opportunity to make amends. Sometimes it's highlighting to us behavior that we need to be reflective about. Shame doesn't do that. Shame shuts us down. It silences us. And so it's really, really important when we feel that shame to kind of not allow it to hide us, not allow it to isolate us. Okay. That's helpful as it's showing my bad behavior in those moments. Thank you. No problem. Okay, so I'm just going back to my notes. So thinking about some of the things that you can be doing to support yourselves on this journey. So I mentioned meditation and kind of having a look around and seeing what works for you. And I mentioned breath work as well. One of the things that I found really, really helpful is future self journaling. Now, I was told to journal really early on in my healing journey, even before I became a clinician. And I found literally witnessing myself on paper too difficult. I found it too exposing and too challenging for me to do. And so future self journaling became a really useful bridge between that and actually starting to kind of use a more creative medium for some sort of catharsis. Future self journaling is about thinking more in a practical way about where you're at now and where it is you want to go, what it is that you're wanting to work on. And you pick a behavior. And I would start small, guys, because you know how that critical voice loves to set us up for a massive fall. Okay, so start with something small, something that feels a bit more obtainable, and work on it for a month. Imagine where you're at now. Imagine how you'd like to challenge yourself with this behavior and how you're going to kind of support yourself to do it. So, including any affirmations. I can share with you a link as well to the future self journaling. I've got a useful little link that can help talk you through it if you guys want to see that. But it's basically thinking about just focusing on one thing at a time rather than giving yourself a kind of blank sheet of paper and expecting yourself to be able to suddenly connect with things if that's too difficult for you. Because being vulnerable just does involve doing something different. And if so much of what you don't like is about you doing the same things over and over again, which is true for all of us, by the way, it's just about doing something, anything differently, making a decision to approach something in a slightly different way. And soon as we start to make these small little changes, they begin to stack up and facilitate much bigger shifts. And that's when the magic happens. That's when things really start to transform for us. I cannot tell you how I couldn't have even possibly imagined being in a relationship with myself that I cared about myself or would be respectful to myself. I couldn't even fathom being in a nurturing relationship with another person. It just seemed entirely impossible to me. Couldn't have imagined being married. That would have been completely strange to me. But as soon as we step away from what's familiar and we're willing to be vulnerable, we take a risk. That's when that change is possible. But it does just take that first step. And I think so many of us live in a world, and I see it all the time and increasingly becoming so polarized, where we're encouraged to see the differences between each of us. And actually, so many of us, we just want to be accepted, we just want to be seen, we just want to be heard. And practicing kindness towards others as well will help you nurture yourselves. Taking the time to be kind to somebody who's getting you a coffee, or somebody that you're buying something from in your local supermarket, asking them how their day going. Just be a bit nicer, show up a bit in your world, and it will make you feel better. We're encouraged to think of ourselves as so different, but actually, we're all just human beings and we all find it difficult to be vulnerable. But when we tune in to our own frailties and start to create work or create lives that connect with other people's frailties and other people's vulnerabilities, that's when something amazing happens. And ultimately, I think being vulnerable is what saved my career. I think I would have been just a hardworking, fairly straightforward clinician. But my willingness to take risks, to connect with people, to share parts of myself with people is an unusual thing for a therapist to do. But for me, it felt like the most organic way of connecting with other people and letting them know that I understood exactly how they felt. And so I guess what I would leave you with today, and I'll certainly answer any more questions that you have at the end, is just considering what some of those core beliefs that you have about yourselves are, and be curious about where they come from. What are the origins of them? And think as well, like I did, about how invested you are in them. How much do you believe them? How much do you actually believe in what you're telling yourself and what you're thinking about things? And if you don't, then give yourself permission to think differently and be a different way. Um, and I think that's about it, guys. I think that's probably it, as much as I was, yeah, thinking about sharing. But obviously, if you've got any questions, I'm here now for another few minutes, so I'll answer anything that's come up for you. No problem at all. I'm so happy. Oh, there's someone that's starting the 8-week program with us. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm really, really pleased that you're joining us. Um, for those of you who have heard me speaking before or haven't, I do try and answer a lot of people's questions on Instagram. Um, and we'll continue to do that on Ask Emmy. So if there's anything there that you think that you're struggling with and you want support with, then do just send a question in, and I will do my best to answer it. We do have free workshops and things coming up. So if there's anything there that you feel like resonates with you or you can connect with, then please do. And I do my book Find Your True Voice is out next week, and you guys can all buy that from online or in your shops, and that talks you through a lot of this process in a bit more detail as well. So I hope you'll find that helpful.